Good morning, one and all. This is Dr. Dana. Welcome to session 10 on modern software engineering. We have been dealing with how agile development methodologies work. We've been starting with our revision of Unit 4, and Unit 4 includes certain planning strategies for agile methodologies. When we try to contrast with traditional software development strategies, we see agile methodologies are more chaotic in nature and they run parallelly, and which is why planning is difficult in agile methodologies. So we have been identifying how to set a vision and release a plan in the earlier session. This session we will be concentrating on risk management. What is risk management? Why do we need risk management? In agile methodologies, when everything is running in parallel and people are working parallelly in teams, how do we foresee risks and how do we mitigate those risks is what we will be discussing in today's session. Risk is anything that can change our plan, that has the potential to change our plan, and a risk is something, if when happening, it will cause either a loss in your time or your schedule or production cost. So if it affects any of these, if a situation happens to affect any of these, then you can call it as a risk. A risk has to be managed in order to make and to meet long-term commitments. So if you're committed to your customer, you need to keep your commitment, or you need to make up your commitment, and you need to meet your commitment. To meet that commitment, you must be able to foresee your risk and to manage it well. Despite uncertainties, your stakeholders need scheduled commitments that they can really rely upon. Risk management allows you to make and meet these commitments. Any risk management has a generic risk management plan. A risk management plan is something that lays out all the possible risks that lie ahead of your project, and for each of the risks that is associated, you try to calculate the cost it will incur in your production if that risk occurs, and then some measures to mitigate the effect of that risk when it actually happens. So these are all parts of your risk management plan. So every project faces a set of common risks such as turnover, new requirements, work disruption, and so forth. These risks act as multiplier in your estimates, doubling or tripling the amount of time it takes to finish your work. So these risk multipliers illustrate an important difference between risky and rigorous approaches. If you use the XP practices, the extreme programming practices in particular, if you're strict about being the done completion criteria in every iteration, your velocity is quite stable and you will be able to fix all your bugs at every iteration, and this would naturally lower down your risks at the end. But if we are trying to combine both the traditional and the extreme programming approach, we might not have this done criteria for every iteration, which might end up with a heavy loss at the end. In order to avoid this, we will identify some of the risks that are particular to a project. So we will be seeing what project specific risks are. So these project specific risks are some of the questions you ask yourself about the project. These questions help us oversee or foresee what risks might lie ahead in the future. So these are some of the questions. What about the project that keeps you up all night? Is there something worrying about the project and its completion? Imagine it's a year after the project's disastrous failure and you are being interviewed about what went wrong. What would your answer be? So think on those lines. Imagine your best dreams for the project. You see your success story for the project. Write down just the opposite. That could be one of your major risks. how could the project fail without anyone being at fault? If everybody did their work right, still can the project fail? How could the project fail if it were the stakeholders' faults, the customers' faults, the testers' faults, programmers' faults, the management's fault, or your own very fault? Find out what faults can occur with each of these people, with each of the stakeholders of the project, and identify your risks. How could the project succeed but leave one specific stakeholder unsatisfied or angry? Is it possible that you meet out all your visions but still you are unable to satisfy your customer? Check if you have put your vision statement in place, and check if all the features that you lay out for your software will satisfy all your stakeholders. And some of the project specific risks, once you list down once you answer these questions, you will have a list of catastrophes. Brainstorm scenarios that could lead to these catastrophes. So you have identified what could go wrong. You now brainstorm with your teammates to see what could cause that catastrophe, or in other words, you imagine or identify the root causes for these failures. These root causes are called your risks. The causes of these scenarios that will lead to failures or catastrophic results. Now, for each of the risks that you identify, you try to estimate whether it's on a very high scale, or medium scale, or a low scale according to the probability of its occurrence. Say, for example, if the risk is very, very negligible, if you think that it might never occur, then you have a very low risk, or you have very less impact if it occurs. Or you can even estimate it very high if you have very high probability of occurrence. Now, specific impact to project if it occurs. Say, for example, if you have a risk that has very low probability, but still if it occurs, the cost will be very, very high. Then it is a very high impact risk. So based on those lines, you will have to scale your impact. You might be able to discard some of the risks as unimportant immediately after you identify them, because they also have a very low estimated probability and their impact is also very low. Such risks you can rule out. Ignore unlikely risks with low impact, and all risks with negligible impact also you can ignore. Your generic risk multiplier accounts for those already. So once you have identified, you will know which are your highest probable risks and which are your highest cost risks. So you will have to devise some methodology to mitigate them. For the risks you decide to handle, those that have higher probability and those that have higher impacts, determine some of the following parameters, such as transition indicators, mitigation plans, contingency activities, and your exposure to the risk. Transition indicators tell you when the risk will come to true. It's human nature to downplay upcoming risks. So choose indicators that are objective rather than subjective. Mitigation activities reduce the impact of the risk. So you plan on some activity that can reduce the impact the risk causes when it occurs. Mitigation happens in advance regardless of whether the risks come to pass or not. Create stories for them and add them to your release plan. Contingency activities also reduce the impact of the risk, but they are only necessary if risks occur. So you plan on something, but you don't create any activity. Only if the risk happens or occurs, you activate your contingency plan. They often depend on mitigation activities that you perform well in advance. Now, risk exposure reflects how much time or money you should set aside to contain the risk or to recover from the risk. To calculate this, first estimate the numerical probability of the risk that it might or might not occur, and then multiply that by the cost of the impact. When considering your impact, remember that you will have already paid for mitigation activities, but contingency activities are a part of the impact too. Now, when you have identified and you have planned for all of that, we need to keep track of certain things. So we need to monitor the risks. One of the hardest things about the project specific risk is that we need to remember to follow up on what we have already planned. It's human nature to avoid unpleasant possibilities, but the best way is to monitor risks, is to assign someone to track them down. The project manager is a good choice for this role, but you can choose anybody on the team. However, when you choose someone who is not the team's constraint, it's more important for them to do things that no one else can do. And every week review your project specific risks and check the transition indicators, whether you have crossed any of the indicators that lead towards the risk. Consider whether the risks are still applicable and ask yourself if any new risks have come into light. If you are going towards some of the, if your transition indicators show that you are moving towards your risk coming into pass, then you will have to plan more on your contingency activity and your mitigation plans. Now this is called as a burn-up chart for predicting some of the release dates after you have your risk management in place. Now the first stepwise shows the actual planning of the project. The diagonal line shows how the project was completed. Now the initial plan was to go for 7 weeks to 8 weeks time, but the actual product has taken 12 weeks of time. So you are able to identify your risks and you project your scope or you project your schedule till 12 weeks and then you give it to the customer in order to avoid explosion in the cost or miss in your schedule. Now, once we identify the risks and move forward, you have projected your timelines properly. How do I identify whether I have accomplished what I projected? Now we will be talking about success over the schedule. Success is more than a delivery date. So you project a date, you deliver it to the customer. That doesn't mean that we are successful. The majority of this discussion of risk management is focused on managing the risk to schedule your commitments, but it also should include how much of quality of product that we deliver to the customer. However, our real goal should be to deliver an organizational success, to deliver software that provides substantial value to your organization as guided by the success criteria presented in your project vision. So this is how we manage risks and this is how we proceed towards completion of the projected plan. This is the end for session 10. We will meet in the next session. This is Dr. Diana signing off.